Okay, we were discussing yesterday the next thing we did after we set up the monuments in the Yarden, and that is we did a bris milah. This is in Perek Hey of Yehoshua. If you're following inside, that's where we're up to Perek Hey. And it mentions Kimulim hayu kolaham hayatzim. All the men who had left Mitzrayim were circumcised, but the people who were born in the desert were not circumcised. They were arelim. There was no bris that was performed in the Midbar. And Mimela, they now have to mal, now that they're entering Eretz Yisrael and are going to bring the Corban Pesach. So, as I mentioned yesterday, the Gemara asked the Kasha in Yevamis, why didn't they circumcise? I mean, fakert. I mean, there's a mitzvah of milah. Why would the Dor HaMidbar not circumcise? So the Gemara explains that from the Chet HaMeraglim onwards, so it wasn't from Yetzias Mitzrayim, but from the Chet HaMeraglim onwards, one of the signs of Hashem's dissatisfaction with us is we did not have the healing north wind, a wind from the north that has medicinal properties, and therefore it would have been a sakana to circumcise a child if they would then have to travel right away. And since the Jews never knew if they would be traveling, even though they may stay in a place for years, but they didn't know. Any minute they could be traveling. There was a constant union of sakana. Now, l'chayr, we have to say, I keep on saying sakana for the child. I mean, apparently it's not just a sakana for the child, it must be a sakana for the adult as well, because these people who were uncircumcised, they eventually grew to be adults. And they still didn't mal in the Midbar. So vice versa, we have to assume the sakana would apply to an adult as well as to a baby. Right? So this was a sakana. So the thing I want to explore is this. We know the halacha is that a person cannot bring a Corban Pesach if they are an Orel. A person who does not have a bris cannot bring a Corban Pesach. But more than that, not only is there a halacha that an Orel cannot bring a Corban Pesach, but even if you have children who are uncircumcised, you cannot bring a Corban Pesach. Now the Gemara explains if the children are less than 8 days old, they're not yet called arelim. So obviously, if I have a 7-day-old child, I can bring the Corban Pesach. But assuming the child has already reached 8 days, this is called milas banav and huadin avadav. May the milah of my children or the milah of my eved kanaini is not only ma'akev them from eating the Corban Pesach and even bringing the Corban Pesach, it's ma'akev me from bringing the Corban Pesach. So here is the thing. Did the Jewish people brought a Corban Pesach in Mitzrayim, that's for sure. That was the first Corban Pesach. And of course, the Torah says everybody circumcised. Did they bring a Corban Pesach in the Midbar? Well, they brought one in Parshas Baloscha, the very first, 1 year after Yetzias Mitzrayim, they brought a Corban Pesach in the Midbar, and you'll recall that is where Pesach Sheni was introduced. That Corban Pesach, there were people who were Tameh, and they said, why should we be deprived from bringing the Corban Pesach? And Moshe didn't know, and he asked Hashem, and Hashem said they could bring it a month later. Right? So Parshas Baloscha is both the description of the Corban Pesach in the Midbar, and it also introduces the halacha of Pesach Sheni. Rashi has a comment that bignus Yisrael hakasav medaber. The Torah is alluding to something that is very shameful on the part of the Jewish people, because in the 40 years of the desert, this was the only Corban Pesach that they brought. Now, again, I'll discuss why in a moment. Meaning to say, they brought a Corban Pesach in Mitzrayim. They brought a Corban Pesach the first year. They were in the Midbar. The next Corban Pesach they're going to bring is the Corban Pesach of Yehoshua ben Nun. There was no other Corban Pesach in all the years of the Midbar. And this was seen, this is described by Chazal, that Rashi quotes, as a genus, as a shame for Klal Yisrael. Now the Meforshim are omed on, well, why didn't they bring a Corban Pesach all the other years? Presumably, if they were simply sinners, Moshe would have made them do it. I mean, what are you going to say? They were Rishoyim that they decided not to bring the Corban Pesach. So the answer that all the Meforshim give is that in reality, the mitzvah of Corban Pesach depends on coming to Eretz Yisrael, because in Parshas Bo it says, when you come to the land, you'll bring a Corban Pesach. And the Pesach in Mitzrayim and the Pesach in the Midbar was a one-time Horas Sha'ah. So instead of asking the question, why didn't they bring the Pesach the rest of the 40 years, the question really is, why did they bring the Pesach that one time? And the answer is, that was a Gezeres HaKosov. The Corban Pesach is called a mitzvah Toluya Ba'aretz. So the Meforshim then ask, so if indeed they were exempt from bringing the Corban Pesach, why is it described as gnus, as a shame? It says, B'gnus, this is a shame for Bnei Yisrael that they only brought one Corban Pesach in 40 years. Why is it a shame? They're putter. They wouldn't be allowed to bring a Corban Pesach. Why is it called gnus? Yeah.
It's mitzvah b'aretz. Why did they do it in the first year then?
That was a one-time Gezeres HaKosov. In other words, that's what he says, a one-time Gezeres HaKosov. So the Maharal is masbir, the gnus is that they wandered in the desert for 40 years. Meaning to say, Einachinami, once they're in the desert, they're exempt from Corban Pesach. But they shouldn't have been in the desert that long. They should have gone to Eretz Yisrael right away, and then they would have brought the Corban Pesach. So the Maharal says, when it says it was a gnus, the Lashon I don't think fits 100% well. When it says it was a shame for Yisrael that they only brought one Corban Pesach in 40 years, it's not the shame that they didn't bring the Corban Pesach, but the shame for the reason they didn't bring the Corban Pesach for 40 years. And that is because of the Chet HaMeraglim and the like. Okay. All of this is well known. This is based on Rashi and based on the Meforshim on Rashi. Rabbi Yehuda Mizrahi, called the Ra'am, Reish Aleph Mem, is considered to be the greatest of the Meforshim. You know, there are more than, just as an aside, do you know there are more than 300 Meforshim on Rashi and Chumash? Rashi and Chumash, there are 300 Meforshim on Rashi and Chumash. We only have a fraction of them, but we have around 50 of them. 50 of them we actually do have. The most famous and greatest of them is the parish of Rabbi Yehuda Mizrahi, who was an early Acharon, shortly after the Beis Yosef, and he's often called Ra'am, Reish Aleph Mem, very, very chashuv, and the Mizrahi goes through all of the Makairis of Rashi, the Medrash, the Gemara, and whenever Ramban has questions on Rashi, the Mizrahi is Miyashiv, the Ramban. So the Mizrahi is a Sefer of Iyun and Pilpul. And then we have the Maharal's commentary, Gur Aryeh, which is much shorter, but also an in-depth commentary. The Lavush wrote a commentary in Rashi. Now, the best-known parish on Rashi in the Mikros Gedolos is called the Sifsei Chachamim. So I hope you use Sifsei Chachamim sometimes to explain Rashi. But you have to understand the Sifsei Chachamim is essentially an anthology of the Mizrahi, the Gur Aryeh, the Lavush. In fact, you'll see when the Sifsei Chachamim says a comment, in parentheses, it'll say Mizrahi, Gur Aryeh, a Lavush. So the Sifsei Chachamim became very popular because it's a very easy format to try to understand the Rashi, but it is based on the major Svarim. Yeah?
Who would be the best commentaries to look at for the Rambam?
For the Ramban, it's tough. The Ramban, there are commentaries on the Ramban, but absolutely not as many as Rashi. Rashi, as I said, 300 commentaries. Ramban, maybe you have 20 commentaries. But the best one would be if you look. Number one, the Art Scroll has a Ramban with annotations, so you can get it in English. And Oz Vahadar, the same people who do the Gemaras, the Mesivta Gemaras, they have a Ramban in Hebrew which explains everything in the Ramban. So I would say either Art Scroll or the Oz Vahadar Ramban will help you. Will help you through it. Now the emes is the Mizrahi itself is a very valuable commentary on the Ramban, because when the Mizrahi analyzes the Machlokes from Rashi and the Ramban, the Mizrahi is masber both sides of it. He's masber Rashi's position, and he's masber Ramban's position. Okay, be it as it may, everything I said about the Corban Pesach is based on Rashi, the Mizrahi, the Goraria, etc. But here's the question I want to raise. If indeed it is the case that from the Chet HaMeraglim onwards, nobody did bris milah, then why don't you give a simple answer? The reason why they didn't bring a Corban Pesach is because they were Arelim. Why do you have to come up with the reason, oh, they didn't bring the Corban Pesach because Corban Pesach is Toloi in Eretz Yisrael? Now, Bishlama, the first Corban Pesach, that was before the Chet HaMeraglim. Okay, be sure you know that. Since the first Corban Pesach was before the Chet HaMeraglim, we still had the Ruach Tziphonis, we had the northern wind, so any newborn babies were circumcised. And of course, everybody who left Mitzrayim was circumcised. But by the time you have the second Pesach, that's after the Chet HaMeraglim already, right? That's after the Chet HaMeraglim. If that's the case, the newborn kids did not circumcise. So why do you have to come up with a new reason why they didn't bring a Corban Pesach in the Midbar? Typically, let it be sufficient, because of the din of Arelos. So here are a few points to make. Point number one, if somebody is an RL because it's a sakana for them to do a bris milah, are they prohibited from bringing the Corban Pesach? Meaning when we say an RL cannot bring or eat a Corban Pesach, is that only if he's able to do a milah? Or would it even apply if it is a sakana for him to do a milah? So in reality, this is a machlokes Rashi and Taisus. Shitas Rashi is, if you are in RL, we don't care what the reason is, even if halachically it is forbidden for you to circumcise, because of hemophilia, because of sakana. The mitzias of an RL, once it's 8 days, is ma'akev in achilas Pesach. So according to Rashi, sakana is not a relevant factor here. Yeah, sakana is a relevant factor if you get a bris or don't get a bris. Yeah, for sure. But sakana is not relevant on giving you a heter to eat a Corban Pesach. Even an RL, because of sakana, cannot eat the Corban Pesach, cannot bring a Corban Pesach. That is Shitas Rashi. Rabbeinu Tam, in Maseches Sevachim, is cholek, and Rabbeinu Tam says, whenever the milah is excusable, so to speak, it's excusable because of sakana, it's not going to be ma'akiv him from eating the Corban Pesach. So, like Rabbeinu Tam, it's very simple why the arelis of the Dor HaMidbar had no impact on their ability to bring a Corban Pesach. Because they didn't do a bris in the Midbar because of sakana. According to Rabbeinu Tam, an RL who doesn't do a bris because of sakana is not mu'ukav in eating the Corban Pesach. So if the only problem would have been arelis, they could have brought the Corban Pesach. So why didn't they bring the Corban Pesach? So the Rishonim have to explain the new idea that Pesach is toloi on coming to Eretz Yisrael. So like Rabbeinu Tam, everything fits very well. Arelis would not have been a problem in the Midbar, Lagabi Corban Pesach. So the problem has to be that until we enter Eretz Yisrael, we're not chayiv in Corban Pesach. And the first Corban Pesach was Haras Sha'at, was a temporary Gezeres HaKosov. But that is good according to Rabbeinu Tam. But according to Rashi, who says that even if you don't circumcise because of sakana, you can't eat a Corban Pesach. So why wouldn't that be the reason not to bring a Corban Pesach? So let's think about this a little bit. Lamaisa, until the 40th year of the desert, there were people who left Mitzrayim who were still alive. I mean, the door didn't die until, they died over 40 years, but they weren't gone until the 40th year. So Lamaisa, even though they weren't doing new brisses in the Midbar after the Meraglim, there were plenty of people who were Mahul, and they could have brought a Corban Pesach. What are you going to tell me? Okay, they could have brought a Corban Pesach, but if they had children who were not Gemalt, right? And according to Rashi, even if it's Pesachana, so that would have been Ma'akiv them. So number one, not everybody had boys. So, which means I'm maskim that had you been able to bring a Corban Pesach in the Midbar, many people couldn't have brought it. People who were uncircumcised couldn't have brought it. People who had children who were uncircumcised couldn't have brought it. But some people could have brought it. Okay? So that's the idea, meaning many people wouldn't have been able to. Ein achinami. But some people would have been able to. So why didn't anybody bring it? Answer has to be because it's totally b'oretz. Meaning, Arelis wouldn't pater everybody. Arelis would pater the people who are Arelim, and it would pater the people who had children, who had boys who were not circumcised. Moreover, I want to point out that the Rambam says, and I'm not aware of anyone that's chaylik, that the only milah of your child that's ma'akiv you is a child that is a katan. Meaning, once my kid hits bar mitzvah, he's on his own. I no longer have the responsibility to circumcise him. So, as a result, even people that had boys, once the boys hit bar mitzvah, they couldn't bring the Corban Pesach, but I could bring the Corban Pesach. Now, the point I'm just making is, Arelis alone would not have destroyed the possibility of Corban Pesach. It would have cut down the number of people who could have brought it, but it would not have eliminated it. And therefore, the actual reason why nobody brought a Corban Pesach is not because of Arelos, but it's because it's a mitzvah toluya ba'aretz, and except the one time Hashem wanted it to be brought in the Midbar once, and as the Gur Aryeh says, the reason this is called a shame of Klal Yisrael is not because they didn't bring the Corban Pesach, they weren't supposed to bring the Corban Pesach, but because of the reason of the Chet HaMeraglim that caused them to wander in the Midbar for 40 years. Okay, everyone understands the general idea. So now we're back in Eretz Yisrael, or we're coming to Eretz Yisrael. Now we're going to bring the Corban Pesach. Now it is no longer a sakana to circumcise. So Yehoshua ben Nun has a mass circumcision ceremony for basically 600,000 people. Big bris, right? Somehow, now, was this, it's hard to believe, but this is a time of miracles. Was this the same? Remember, the day they crossed the Yarden, they run up with huge stones to Har Eval, 50 kilometers away. They build a mizbeach. They bring korbanos. They have the brachos and the klalos. Then they dismantle the mizbeach. Then they run back to Gilgal. And it's still daytime. Is that the day they did the bris of 600,000? Did they do it then? I don't know. I have to check exactly if even that happened. But if it didn't happen then, it happened the next day. In other words, it happened very, very soon afterwards. So it's a very, very busy time. And after the bris milah, in fact, this is why the place is called Gilgal. It says Gilgal. Gilgal is to roll over. Because Hashem says, this day, Galosi, I have rolled away from you what is called Cherpas Mitzrayim, the shame of the Egyptians. Again, this is the idea that the Egyptians, really, as all Goyim, are uncircumcised. They are Arelim. They have the Tumah of the Orel. In fact, in Yiddish, by the way, a common term for it's a derogatory term, for a Goy is that Orel, that uncircumcised person. That's what they refer to a guy, an Ohr. Right? So an Ohr was a sign of shame, of humiliation. And Gilgal, Hashem says, you have rolled away the tumah of Mitzrayim that you had with you. Okay, and as I indicated, that is actually read because this story of the Milah and the Corban Pesach, which is coming up, is Pesach, obviously. So this is the Haftorah of the first day of Pesach, this part of Sefer Yehoshua. So when you see the Haftorah on Yom Tov, so you'll know the story. So after the Bris Milah, we then have the celebration of the Corban Pesach, the first Corban Pesach in 40 years. One could imagine what a great, great, great simcha it was, the closeness to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Now, in the Midbar, of course, the Corban Pesach was brought in the Mishkan, meaning to say it was, again, let's go over a very just basic picture. Corban Pesach, when do you bring the Corban Pesach? You bring the Corban Pesach on Erev Pesach. You bring the Corban Pesach on the 14th of Nisan. It is shechted in the courtyard, the Azara of the Beis HaMikdash. The blood is sprinkled on the Mizbeach, the outer Mizbeach, not the Mizbeach in the Mikdash, which is the golden altar for Ketores, but the outer Mizbeach in the courtyard. Internal organs and fats are burnt on the Mizbeach. They are called hekter emurim. Emurim are the internal fats. Okay, so we have shechita, we have kabbalah sadam, we have zerika sadam on the Mizbeach. We have the burning of the emurim. What then happens with the meat? So the meat is not eaten in the Beis HaMikdash or in the courtyard of the Beis HaMikdash. The meat would be eaten anywhere in Yerushalayim. Each family would take its lamb after the emurim were removed. Right, so the emurim are burnt on the Mizbeach, and they would take their lamb somewhere to Yerushalayim, anywhere. People would obviously rent places or the like, and they would roast the lamb whole, and then they would divide the lamb among the group of people, family plus other people, called a chabura. And the mitzvah is each person should eat a kazayas of the Corban Pesach. So remember, the Corban Pesach was not the main meal. That's why we say you eat the Corban Pesach when you're already filled with other foods. The afikomen at the Seder is lezecher the Corban Pesach. Okay? So the Pesach was only a kazayas. You have to eat a kazayas of the Corban Pesach, and you have to eat it lechatchila before midnight. Whether you could eat it after midnight until the morning is a machlokas tanoim. What is the zman of the Corban Pesach? So remember, therefore, that the Corban Pesach was shechted in the courtyard of the Beis HaMikdash, and the blood was sprinkled on the Mizbeach by the Kohanim, and the emurim were burnt on the Mizbeach. But the roasting of the Pesach and the eating of the Pesach was anywhere in Yerushalayim. Now, how did that work in the Midbar? Okay, just to see how it worked in the Midbar. In the Midbar, they only brought one Corban Pesach. So obviously they're not in Eretz Yisrael, there's no Yerushalayim. But the way it worked was simply this. The courtyard of the Mishkan also had a Mizbeach. So it was shechted in the courtyard of the Mishkan. The blood was sprinkled. Let me point out, putting the blood on the doorpost only happened in the Pesach in Mitzrayim. That never happened again. Okay, don't confuse that. The ceremony of putting the blood on the doorpost so the Malach HaMabes will not enter your house, that is a unique ritual of Pesach Mitzrayim that did not apply to the Pesach even in the Midbar, and Kal V'chomer, it does not apply to any Corban Pesach brought afterwards. But in the Midbar, the Chatzar HaMishkan, the courtyard of the Mishkan, was where they shechted the Pesach and were zorek the dam and burnt the emurim. Where did people roast their Corban Pesachs? So here they have free reign, because all of Machane Yisrael had the status of what later became Yerushalayim, and therefore they just took it home. They could roast it anywhere in the Machane was considered to be valid. Now, So I described right now two situations. I described how they brought the Pesach in the Midbar and how they brought the Pesach in Yerushalayim when there was a Beis HaMikdash. What about this Corban Pesach? Now this Corban Pesach, they're in Gilgal. So I should have mentioned, and maybe this is obvious, that they actually still have the Mishkan with them. In Gilgal, the Mishkan of Bezalel was erected. So essentially, everything is exactly the way it was 40 years before, except for the fact that they're in Eretz Yisrael. They set up the Mishkan in Gilgal. In the courtyard of the Mishkan is a big Mizbeach. The Corban Pesach is shechted and the blood is sprinkled and the Emurim are burned. And then people were able, in the Machane Yisrael, they were able to roast their Corban Pesachs and eat them, a kazayas for everybody among the Chabura, okay? And indeed, the Mishkan of Moshe will serve in one way or the other for many, many, many years until the Beis HaMikdash is built, right? There actually is this Mishkan of Moshe that is still around. So the Mishkan did not end its existence when we cross the Yarden. It continues to be the equivalent of the Beis HaMikdash in Eretz Yisrael itself. By the way, the miracle of the bringing of the Corban Pesach itself is a great miracle because you have a very, very small window of time. The Pesach cannot be brought earlier than Chatzos, the middle of the day, Erev Pesach. And it has to be shechted and the blood sprinkled before night, before sunset. Yeah, you can roast the meat at night and eat it at night. That's when we eat it. But the shechita and the zerika and the haktorah of the emurim have to be done before shkia. And you can do it no later than chatzos. So you have an absolute maximum of 6 hours. And the truth is they actually started later than that as well. So how many, I'm sorry, no earlier than Chatzos. Yeah, no earlier than Chatzos. So you have a tremendously small window. Now, how many Corban Pesachs were actually brought? Now, granted, just because you have 600,000 people, that doesn't mean you have 600,000 Corban Pesachs, right? You can have 200 people on a Corban Pesach. But certainly, later, the populations were even bigger. I mean, in the time of the second Beis HaMikdash, there were several million people who brought Corban Pesachs. And Josephus, the Jewish historian, actually records things like 500,000 Corban Pesachs were brought. Like for a 3 million or 5 million population, let's say they brought 500,000 Corban Pesachs. So can you imagine? 500,000 lambs have to be slaughtered, the blood sprinkled, the emurim burnt, in a span of less than 6 hours. Okay, it was pretty amazing. By the way, Erev Pesach was the Roman nightmare. Of course, as you know, Yashka was crucified around that time. Erev Pesach was the Roman nightmare because the Jews hated the Romans for very good reason. But Erev Pesach is when you had millions of Jews come to Yerushalayim. So the big thing the Romans were afraid of is they were always afraid of riots. So they had like extra Roman police and the like. And that's why Yeshua got crucified. A guy shows up. I mean, imagine this, you have this security nightmare and this guy shows up on a donkey proclaiming that he's king of the Jews or something. So the Romans didn't spend that much time. So get rid of him, So it was like, the Christians make it as such a unique ceremony. I mean, there probably were like 20 people making those claims and the like, and all of them, the Romans would dismiss immediately because they were just afraid that there would be an explosion. So Erev Pesach was a very, very big security nightmare for the Romans because that was the day in which so many millions of people came. You see, for the other Shalosh Regalim, it wasn't always the case. Let me explain why. It's true that for Shavuos and Sukkot also, there's a chiyuv to come, but that could be spread over 7 days. Even Shavuos, you had 7 days. So not everybody came the same day. A lot of people could come Chol HaMoed, Sukkot. On Sukkot, I could be Makayim, my mitzvah to come to Yerushalayim. I come on Chol HaMoed. So for all the other Yomim Tovim, including Shavuos, even though Shavuos is only 1 day, you actually have 7 days to be Ola Regel. So you didn't necessarily have millions of people in 1 day. Pesach, however, was a bit unique because in addition to the mitzvah of being Ola Regel, which Pesach has as well, you have the special mitzvah of Corban Pesach. So Corban Pesach, unless you were Tameh or the like, that did require that you show up on Erev Pesach. Memela, Erev Pesach was probably the most crowded, of course, the day after as well, Pesach, the first day of Pesach, was the most crowded day. It was the day of the largest number of Jews who were in Yerushalayim, and as I say, the Romans were pretty worried about that all the time. Was there someone had a hand up? Yeah.
Yes, so for the Jews that were in the diaspora communities at the time, like in Babylon or Alexandria, because they were much further away, were they also chayav to go all the way from pre-Pesach to Yerushalayim?
Yeah, so the interesting thing is, this is interesting. L'chayra, in order to be chayav to come to Eretz Yisrael, you do have to own land. You have to own land in Eretz Yisrael. But if you own some land in Eretz Yisrael, you have to come even if you're in Chutz La'aretz. Now, Korban Pesach is interesting because there is a din of Pesach Sheni if you're far away. But that just means you come a month later. But l'chayra, this is a good question. Even if I'm far away and I'm patur from Korban Pesach, I'm still chayav in Olas Re'iyah to come to, right? That doesn't. There's no patur of derech rechaika to be Ayla Regel. So what do you really gain? You only gain 2 days. I don't have to show up Erev Pesach, I can come Chol HaMoed. But on the other hand, as I indicated, if you didn't own land, you're patur. The Gemara in Pesachim gives a very fascinating story. Listen to this story. The Gemara in Pesachim gives the story that Rabbi Yehuda ben Basera lived far away. He was not able to be Ola Regel or bring Korban Pesach during the Second Temple. He had a Geisha neighbor who used to go to Yerushalayim every Pesach. And he would boast to Rabbi Yehuda ben Basera, when I go, I eat the best parts of the Korban Pesach. As he passed himself up as a Jew, he got himself invited to a Korban Pesach, to a Seder, and he ate the Korban Pesach. So he tells Rabbi Yehuda, I enjoy eating the Korban Pesach every year. Of course, there's Nishur D'Oraisa to give a guy Korban Pesach. So Rabbi Yehuda ben Basera said to him, did you ever eat the fat tail? The tail of the lamb is the most delicious thing. Next time you go, be sure you ask for the tail. Now, the tail is one of those things that's burnt on the Mizbeach. We don't eat it at all. So he shows up next year. They give him his Korban Pesach portion, and he says, I want the tail. So they said, the tail? The tail is what we burn on the Mizbeach. Who told you to ask for the tail? He says, a great rabbi, my neighbor, Rabbi Yehuda ben Basera. So they realized if Rabbi Yehuda ben Basera told him to ask for the tail, he was trying to get him discovered as a guy so they would know what he was. And he was determined to be a guy, and it mentions they killed him. So there actually is a discussion. Okay, the guy did a bad thing. He ate the Korban Pesach. He was a guy. That's an Isser D'Oraisa. It's not a Chi of Misa. On what basis would they be allowed to kill him? What are they killing him? So some Meforshim actually say that since the Torah says that a Korban Pesach is only eaten by Jews, a non-Jew who eats a Korban Pesach is transgressing the Noachide Aveira of theft, and any violation of the Noachide Aveiras is a Chi of Misa, and therefore he's Chi of Misa al Skineva, and the like. But be it as it may, we do have that one instance of Rav Yehuda ben Basera who was not Ayla Regel, presumably Taisa says because he didn't own land in Eretz Yisrael and he was patur from being Ayla Regel. Okay. But in terms of, again, just to repeat, in terms of just because you're far, as far as I understand, if you own land and you just live far away, that's only a patur of Corban Pesach. That's not a patur of Eila Regel. There's no patur of Derech Rechaika per se for Eila Regel, which I have to say kind of doesn't make sense to me because, I mean, the Torah says if you're far away, you can bring the Corban Pesach a month later. But if you have to be Eila Regel, it turns out that you got to show up 2 days later anyway. So you're not really gaining anything with the dispensation of Pesach Sheni if you say you're chayav to be Eila Regel. So that's a kasha to think about. Okay. Now, we bring the Corban Pesach, and then the Torah mentions, I'm sorry, not the Torah, the Book of Yehoshua mentions a very interesting thing, that the day after Pesach, meaning the first day of Chol HaMoed, 16th of Nisan, they stopped eating man. Remember, I had mentioned the man stopped falling after Moshe Rabbeinu's death, but the man remained in their kalim. They could store up the man, and they were living off the man. They were living off the man through the 15th of Nisan, but starting from the 16th of Nisan, they no longer had man. I guess whatever man was left disintegrated, because they began to eat the grain of the land. So once again, in Sefer Yehoshua, there are a lot of allusions to Halacha that you need to keep in mind. Here we're dealing with the prohibition of Chadash. Chadash is what? Grain that grows in Eretz Yisrael. This does not apply to fruit or vegetables. It only applies to the 5 grains. I'm not allowed to eat that grain of Eretz Yisrael until an Omer offering of barley is brought on the 16th of Nisan. And when the Omer offering is brought, I'm allowed to eat the new grain. Right? The Omer, Hakravas HaOmer, Matirs, Chadash. I'll talk about Bisman Hazeh in a moment. We don't have, right? How do we eat grain today? It's because if you don't bring the Omer, okay, well, I'll talk about today a little later, but I just first want to understand the story. The Jewish people crossed the Yarden on the 10th of Nisan. There's plenty of grain growing there. It's the Jewish people's land. They could take the grain. But they're not allowed to eat that grain, because that grain was not yet permitted by the bringing of the Omer. Because the Omer is not going to be brought until the 16th of Nisan. So, for day 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, they were not permitted to eat Chadash. Therefore, they were still surviving on the man. So when was the first time they were allowed to eat the Chadash? The 16th of Nisan, when they brought, in the Mishkan in Gilgal, they brought the Omer barley offering, which allows them to eat the Chadash. So the 16th of Nisan marks the first day that they are man-less. They don't have man anymore, because they could eat from the Chadash. Now, just as an aside, Bisman Hazeh, we don't have a Beis HaMikdash. How am I allowed to eat grain? There was no Omer offering that mattered the grain. So the Gemara in Rosh Hashanah explains that we have 2 halachas. When there's a Beis HaMikdash or a Mishkan, whatever it is, you cannot eat the new grain until the Omer is actually brought. When there's no Beis HaMikdash, D'oraisa, you are allowed to eat from the new grain as soon as it is dawn of the Omer day, which would mean the following. When you have a Beis HaMikdash or a Mishkan, I cannot eat the new grain until the Omer is actually brought. If that happens to be 12 noon, I can't eat it until 12 noon. Shelo B'zman HaMikdash, it is not the Omer that matters, it is the day that matters. Meaning, I cannot eat the new grain until the morning of the 16th of Nisan. But once the morning comes, I'm allowed to eat it. You understand, of course, everything that's Chadash becomes Yashan, meaning once you bring the Omer, or once the day comes, that's called old grain. And the prohibition of Chadash will only be on the grain that grows after the Omer is brought. Right, and you get what it is. In other words, the Omer matirs, or the day matirs, all grain that's already there. Grain that comes later is not going to be mutter till next Omer. That's why people have to know when grain was harvested and everything else. So, the Pasuk tells us that the Jewish... then I want to add something. I want to add Rav Yochanan ben Zakkai made a takana that you're not allowed to eat Chadash until the 17th, meaning he made it one day later, meaning D'oraisa, you could eat it the morning of the 16th. He said you can't eat it till the morning of the 17th. Okay, I'll discuss later why he made it a takana, but that's the halacha. The halacha is that Chadash B'zman Hazeh is usher until the morning of the 17th of Nisan. And in Chutz La'aretz, that would be the morning of the 18th of Nisan because of calendrical doubt. Okay. Beseder, we'll go back to that. Again, it's a digression, but these types of digressions I think are worthwhile to talk about. They're Nagel Halacha. Okay. But be it as it may, the Pasuk is telling me the Jewish people did not eat the new grain until the 16th of Nisan. So now the Talmud Yerushalmi asks a fascinating question. The Torah says when you eat the Corban Pesach, you also have a mitzvah d'oraisa of eating matzah with the Corban Pesach. And when do you eat the Corban Pesach? The night of the 15th of Nisan. So l'chayra, matzah, you can't make matzah from mun. Matzah has to be the 5 species of grain. So l'chayra, how could they eat matzah at the Seder? See, Bishlama every other year it's not a problem because they can use the old grain, meaning once you start bringing the Omer, they can use the old grain for matzah. But here there is no old grain because there's no grain for which an Omer Corban was ever brought. So what did they do about matzah the first night of Pesach, if there was an Isser of Chadash? So the Talmud Yerushalmi says, quite amazingly, they didn't fulfill the mitzvah of matzah because there was no permissible matzah they would be able to eat. All matzah would have been chadash. Chadash is not going to be permitted till the 16th of Nisan, which is too late for the Corban Pesach. So then the Talmud Yerushalmi asks the kasha, I guess I'll hold it over for next week, but just to mention the kasha. But wait a second here. Don't we have a rule in Halacha that if there's a mitzvah saseh, if there is a positive mitzvah, thou shalt do something, and there's a negative commandment, thou shalt not do something, and the only way, this is important, the only way I could fulfill the positive is by transgressing the negative, then the halacha is the positive overrides the negative. This is a famous klal in Shas. It is called aseh doche lo ta'aseh. the positive overrides the negative. Now, for Pesach, it's a davar pashut. If I had matzah that did not have a prohibition, but I want to use the matzah that has a prohibition because it tastes better, of course you don't say esei docha lo sasa, because you could have avoided the conflict with the negative by taking the permissible. So nobody's going to say you can violate something because there's a positive mitzvah. But when there's no other way of doing it, the positive overrides the negative. So frek the Yerushalmi asks the kasha, if that is the case, then they should have eaten matzah. Because even though there's an Isser Da'oraisa of Chadash, which is a negative commandment, do not eat, the Torah says in Parshas Emor, do not eat the new grain until the Omer is brought. It's a negative commandment. Yeah, for sure. If I eat Chadash before the Omer, I'm Chayev Malkus. Yeah. But there's a positive mitzvah, be Erev, Teichlu, Matzahs. The night of Pesach, you have to eat matzah. So frek the Yerushalmi, if there's no other matzah but matzah shel Chadash, why shouldn't we say aseh doche lo sasa? Okay, we'll talk about the terutzim. Yeah.
Mitzvah aseh doche lo sasa. How does that trump mitzvah of Avera?
Yeah, excellent question. We'll talk about that on Monday. We have a collision course between two rules that seem to say exactly the opposite thing. Esei docha lo sasa says the positive mitzvah overrides the negative, and go ahead and do the positive, even though you're transgressing a negative. Mitzvah ba bi'avera says when you do a mitzvah through the commission of an avera, not only do you have a sin, which of course you have, but you don't even have a mitzvah at all. So how can you possibly say an aseh docha lo sasa if we have a rule? Right, I steal a lulav. Right? We don't say, oh, the positive mitzvah of lulav will override the issur of stealing. We don't say that. The other way around. We say, mitzvah ba bi'avera, it's totally invalid. That's a very good question. We'll talk about that as well, okay? But again, you see how so many halachic issues come out of the Nevi'im. It's something to... it's interesting. People learn Tanakh for different reasons, but for B'nai Torah, who historically did not learn Nach, unfortunately, but one of the things that can pull you in is that there's a lot of inyanim of Gemara that you can learn out of from the Nevi'im. So even if your interest is only Gemara, it's worthwhile to learn Nach because you can get a lot of Gemara knowledge from Nach as well. That's not the only reason, but it's a thing I think that is Moshech B'nai Torah in particular, that they would gravitate towards that type of inyan. Okay, we'll see you. Good show.
Thank you for listening to this Ohr Somayach production. To find out more and to partner in our mission, please visit ohr.edu.